Hi, this is Eric from longboxreview.com. Welcome to the show and welcome to part 2 of our Humanoids Life Drawn series, where George from Meanwhile at the Podcast and I are taking a look at Twilight Man, Rod Serling and the Birth of Television by Corin Shadme. Enjoy. All right, George, shall we just jump right into Twilight Man, our second book?
Yes, please. Let's do it.
All right. So Twilight Man, Rod Serling, and the Birth of Television, published in 2019. This is by Corin Shadme, who did story and art. And World Design did the letters, and Fabrice Sapolsky was the editor. So Twilight Man, for those who may not have ever heard of Rod Serling, I can't imagine, maybe some younger listeners, George, perhaps, maybe, don't know who Rod Serling is.
In a dimension of sight and sound, perhaps someone has not heard of Rod Serling. Mm-hmm.
All right, so this is the book blurb that I pulled this from, a biographical tale that follows Hollywood revolutionary Rod Serling's rise to fame in the golden age of television, and his descent into his own personal Twilight Zone. Dun dun dun. We recognize him as our sharply dressed, cigarette-smoking tour guide of the Twilight Zone, but the entertainment business once regarded him as the, quote, angry young man of television, which actually I did not know about that until I read this. Before he became the revered master of science fiction, Rod Serling was just a writer who had to fight to make his voice heard. He vehemently challenged the networks and viewership alike to expand their minds and standards, rejecting notions of censorship, racism, and war. But it wasn't until he began to write about real-world enemies in the guise of aliens and monsters that people lent their ears. In doing so, he pushed the television industry to the edge of glory and himself to the edge of sanity. Rod operated in a dimension beyond that of contemporary society, making him both a revolutionary and an outsider. So, yeah, Rod Serling is, again, just to put a fine point on it, Rod Serling was the creator, host, writer, sometimes performer, but he worked on the very, it became popular, very popular, much like Star Trek in later years in syndication, right, of the Twilight Zone series that lasted, I think it was 5 years in the late 50s. Early 60s?
I think that's what it said, because when they finally canceled it, I think at the party there was a thing that said 5 years and however many episodes there were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, he did other things after that. He did Night Gallery, which was sort of a kind of a ripoff of some Twilight Zone show. Although, as I discovered reading this book, that was not his intent.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll touch on the details there. But then he also hosted other things later. He was also the screenwriter, I think, of record for Planet of the Apes, the first Planet of the Apes movie, and a bunch of other things. But there you go. That's probably the major things for Rod Serling. Here's another quote, critic's quote from Publishers Weekly, and somewhat familiar to us based on the last book that we talked about. And Publishers Weekly said, while the book introduces the kind of dramatic final twist its subject would have approved, less attention is paid to the psychology behind why Serling so often concocted them.
Okay. Now, I've had a little time to think about that kind of criticism when it comes to this book and what we heard about the Hedy Lamarr book.
Mm-hmm.
And for as much as we kind of maybe panned a little bit that bit in the Hedy book, where there were those opportunities for exposition toward the tail end of the book, more to explain what happened without showing it. When it comes right down to it, what they were explaining wasn't really the most exciting part of her life.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And she was becoming reclusive and things of that nature. But those things needed to be touched upon. And in this graphic medium, a lot of what makes it entertaining is not only the text and the research that goes into it, but what is the pictures that are on the page. So some of those things I can almost forgive.
Mm-hmm.
That the things that the critics of both these books are referring to, I can forgive that, because I don't think adding what they think is missing, I don't think it would have necessarily added to the sequential art part of the entire whole of a graphic novel.
Yeah, I guess I suppose it depends on what is your intent as the creator of this story.
Mm-hmm.
What
Right,
are you trying to accomplish here? Are you just trying to give a chronological listing of accomplishments, peppered along the way with some psychological insights, or at the very least, some observations about what was going on in the subject's life that may perhaps have informed the creative drive or vision or accomplishments of the subject. So, or are you trying to be, and I'm sure we'll talk about this for the next book, a little more creative, a little more what's the term I'm looking for here? Artsy in your approach, in your
right, taking some license.
Yeah. There you go.
That's how you present the story.
That's a good way to put it. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, and in this book in particular, it's not like Rod Serling is operating in a vacuum. I mean, we do see some influences, and
oh yes,
they do get touched upon late throughout the book. I mean, what he experienced in World War II. He read comics. He loved the radio dramatist Norman Corwin, so he was listening to radio plays consistently and was heavily influenced by that person on the radio, more than anyone that was mentioned. And all that put together, and again, it is these events are referred to throughout the book, whether they're mentioned or in a visual, to show these things surrounding Rod Serling, in a comic booky way. I think I got enough to feel that I understood what influenced him to go in the directions that he went, make some of the choices that he made. Mm-hmm. And if a critic is saying that these things were missing from a graphic novel, whether it be the Rod Serling one or the Hedy Lamarr one, I would say maybe you should stick to prose, because a 400-page, well, let's face it, if you wanted that kind of detail, you're going to get a 400-page prose biography, which probably plenty exists. This is a graphic novel to acquaint us with the subjects, and if we want more, we can get more.
Okay, yes, but again, I'll counter with Marilyn's
Devil's
Monsters.
Advocate. I love this.
Right?
George, you ignorant slut.
It's just and granted, Twilight Man is 178 pages, right? And Marilyn's Monsters is over 200. I forget the exact count right now. Mm-hmm. And so obviously there is more to that graphic novel than this one. But we did see that psychological depth in Marilyn's Monsters that we're not getting here. I agree with you to a certain point, right? That I think, the connections are kind of obvious, and they're at least implied. And I think we'll talk about some of these as we get into the details here. But yeah, so I agree with you, like I said, to a point that, Publishers Weekly is probably being a little too demanding in its critique of this book.
And I'm going to counter again. But I won't call you an ignorant slut. But I'm going to counter again by just saying that, okay, there was a greater page count in Marilyn's Monsters, which we will discuss. But also the team that wrote that book approached telling the life story of this person in a totally different way than what we're experiencing in the Hedy Lamarr book and the Rod Serling book. Like you said, they're really just chronological depictions of their life, with very little embellishment. I guess there's some embellishment just to increase the drama, because let's face it, all our lives aren't as interesting unless you add a couple of things in there. You add a little tweaks here and there, but you get the gist of the story, the story of their lives. So Marilyn's Monsters, as folks, if you haven't read it yet, I believe you should, but you will see that there is a big difference between how Marilyn's Monsters portrays Marilyn Monroe's life as opposed to these two books that we're talking about now, which I think might be considered more straightforward narratives.
Yeah. I certainly don't want to imply to anybody that Twilight Man is a lesser product because of its approach to its subject matter. It's a very entertaining read. You mentioned when we first started into these books, before we even got into talking about the particular books, that this one was the art style was probably more the mainstream, familiar to most comic book readers, right? So,
right,
very well told.
Great line work.
Yep.
Great line work. In fact, not photorealistic at all, but you're looking at Rod Serling.
Oh yeah,
Some of the other famous people in the book. In fact, I can remember only one panel, Desi Arnaz. That panel, but it's not photorealistic, but it's Desi Arnaz.
Yeah, exactly. Which to me, that's a great cartoonist that is able to capture the likeness without being photorealistic.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I love Shad Me's work on this. Mm-hmm. So and so I'm right now, George. I'm looking at the cover of the book, and I have it digitally. I know you have this in your hot little hands.
Yes, and I actually even gave a copy of this to somebody for Christmas.
Oh, nice.
It just goes to show how much I enjoyed the book. I felt it was great enough for a friend of mine. I would want him to check it out.
Did this friend read it already?
Oh yeah. This was this past Christmas, and he read it over the break. He was off.
And did he like it?
He loved it. Oh yeah, he loved it.
Oh yeah, good.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm looking.
He's a person. Just to elaborate, he's a person who was heavily into comics back when we were in high school together and when we went off to college, but realized, a lot of us don't continue into our adult lives like you and I do, and your listeners. So he's one of those people who dropped off after his college years, but he likes to kind of keep track, dabble a little bit, but he really doesn't read. Something like this would never be on his radar. But knowing he's a Twilight Zone fan, knowing that he's a fan of comics, I sent it to, actually, even like Rod Serling. Rod Serling's birthday is Christmas Day. Like you and I, he's a December baby, but he's earlier in December.
Oh, I think you've told me about this before. Yeah.
Yeah. So I sent it to him, but for some reason people still forget his birthday. So, I sent it to him and he really enjoyed it. He loved the book.
Good. Yeah. And I think just about anybody who wants to read a good biographical comic, this is definitely one to start with. Mm-hmm. But like I said, the cover here, it's got Rod Serling. He's got that ever-present cigarette in his hand. Mm-hmm. And then what I thought was what artist Shad Me did was really cool. He's wearing his trademark suit and tie, white shirt, right?
Yeah.
Superimposed over his suit, his black jacket, is all these images from the Twilight Zone. That opening, that classic opening from the Twilight Zone, the big eye, the door that opens, the spiral. Not spiral. What's that?
Kind of like the Vertigo.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to say, but I think you're right in that it's a spiral.
Yeah, you're right. And the E equals MC squared. All that classic stuff. And we're actually going to a little bit later, I think, we'll end our discussion of this book with the interstitial pages that separate the parts of this book, because they've got a lot more of this imagery directly from the episodes of the Twilight Zone. So I thought it'd be kind of fun just to see how many we can recognize. And there were some that I certainly did not know, because I admit I love the Twilight Zone and I've seen many episodes over the years, but I certainly have not watched every episode of its 5-year run. So I'm sure there are things that I just couldn't know because of that. So.
Now, I guess before we start this, do we need a spoiler alert on this? I mean, I know, I know it really is just a life story, but you mentioned it in the blurb about a twist, and I don't know. Should we at least do we bother or?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, we should definitely bother with this. Could get spoilery for sure, because it's such a delightful little thing.
Yeah.
Although I may have a critique of that when we get to it. So, not may. I do.
Okay. And to be honest with you, if we start with if we talk about the framing sequence,
Mm-hmm.
some people may even, kind of figure
Yeah, it was kind of obvious.
Something's up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and yeah. So okay, let's talk. Well, okay. Before we get to the framing sequence, I just want to point your attention, George, to this, and of course the listeners. The title page of this book has Serling falling backwards into that famous spiral. So I want to preface our discussion with that, right? Which I thought that's a very cool image on the page, but I think it ties into the greater narrative here. So, okay. So then that's when we get into part one of this, and we discover Rod Serling is on this airplane. It's a red-eye flight, I guess. It's a night flight anyway. People are smoking on the plane, which gives you grounds you in terms of the time period when that was allowed.
And it's a Pan Am flight.
And it's a Pan Am, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He is talking to this young woman who's sitting next to him, and they just start talking, and it's a long flight. And so she convinces him to basically tell his life story. That's the premise of this book, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to point out here, George, in this framing sequence. This is, what page is this? That's the hard thing about the digital book. This one does not tell me the page numbers.
Oh, really?
I have to, yeah. I think it's page 10 or 11. I can't tell. So they're talking, and then there is, we see a shot of looking down the airplane, and we see all these other passengers behind them, beside them, in the rows, and notice their faces, everybody's faces.
Mm-hmm.
They're dark. They're black, literally black. You cannot see the features of these folks' faces. And so we'll come back with very few exceptions, and that we'll come back to this at the end of our discussion. I just want to point that out directly for right now. And then we get into basically the bulk of part one, which is his wartime experiences. And this is World War II, of course. And George, I found, for the most part, this was, I think, out of all the parts, this was what I felt was, and we talked about it in kind of general terms before we got into this, but this was the part that made me think, oh, this is where everything about the Twilight Zone started for him.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
I would agree.
Yeah. So, there's a bunch of different vignettes of his time in the army. He experienced death, struggles. There was a point where they were starving. People were eating tree limbs. I think there was one panel showing that, or roots or something. I can't remember exactly. And of course, being shot at. A Japanese soldier had a landmine taped to his hand, and he dove into one of the foxholes. So just that, the sheer goofy travesty, the terror of uncertainty. There was one of his fellow soldiers. This was towards the end of the section, George, if you remember. The army was parachuting down supplies, food and supplies, right? And the guy's freaking out, looking up at the sky. Basically, he's dancing. He's so happy that they finally they're getting food. And what happens? The parachuting crate crushes him. I think it decapitates him too.
Yeah, and that was very specific.
Yeah.
Which leads me to believe it actually happened, as opposed to just being some random thing that a writer would put in there, because you could put anything in about a war that would traumatize anybody. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it could just random, like for instance, the Japanese soldier making the kamikaze run into the foxhole. I mean, whether or not that really happened, that's something that you could easily see a writer taking liberties on. But something as specific as the ration crate crushing and decapitating his fellow infantry person, that is a little too specific. So I'm pretty inclined to believe that actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Serling in the story even remarks about the surreal reality of battle, and the randomness of it all was mind-boggling, is what he told his fellow passenger.
That is so funny that you almost have, you either wrote down the same quote that I have, or you're looking at the same page. Because I did want to, because right here, I think on page 48 in in the actual physical copy, in the first panel, he says, after a few weeks in rehab, I was sent back into the field. Oh yeah. And he was injured. So another thing that would wreak havoc on your psyche. As I returned to the surreal reality of battle, almost what you just said verbatim, it dawned on me that I was now part of the living dead.
Mm-hmm.
So if he was feeling that way, right there, I know that's the writer writing those sentences. But if that was even an inkling of what was going through his mind, like you said, you could see the beginnings of how a creative person processes this horror. And his therapy eventually is going to be putting it toward his creative juices and writing about it in whatever way possible. So yes, you're right. I agree with you 100%. This part one here is the foundation of the Rod Serling that we've all come to know and love.
Okay, so before we transition to what you just brought up, because that is the next part of this book, there's a couple things about this first part that I want to point out. You mentioned he read comic books. There's a scene in which he actually is reading a comic that I actually looked up. It's called Planet Comics. It was issue number 11, and he says about it, there's some good stuff in here. He even says even a Martian could do Shakespeare. And so I thought, again, like you were just saying about the crate, that was a very specific reference. And so I thought, is that a Twilight Zone reference that I just don't know? I'm not getting. I couldn't find anything about that, but I thought that was really cool. That and the way that Shadme draws he reproduces the cover of Planet Comics and does a very good job of it. Because, like I said, I looked it up and
you're able to find it. Yeah,
now I want to go read those comics if I could even find them. So, I love it when, pop culture things like that, like this, Rod Serling, The Twilight Zone, in some small measure had some influences by the very things that we are now talking about. And, we love to talk about in general. Right. So I dig that meta aspect of comics within comics within comics. So, and then, the other thing that we should point out about this, which also informs the later parts of his story, is that Serling was shown as being a very determined guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a big guy. He's not a tall guy. He's somewhat small in stature, but he really wanted to be a paratrooper. And I'm not sure if we got into why he wanted to be a paratrooper, but he was very dogged in his pursuit of that goal. And eventually, because of his persistence, his superior said, all right, fine, go try to be a paratrooper. And where a lot of people apparently wash out of that, he did not. Mm-hmm. And in fact, later in his life, or actually, I think in the next section, he continued that pursuit in a different way. He also wanted to be a boxer or enjoyed boxing and was pretty good at it for when he was boxing certain individuals. But then he kind of got, I think, at least this is what I got of it. He kind of got a little outside of his comfort zone, thinking he could take on bigger guys, and turned out that that was not the case. But what it shows is, like I said, he was a very determined guy, and he was willing to take on bigger adversaries. And so that will play into the next part too.
I'm looking, you said we don't really know what his motivation was, why he so doggedly pursued becoming a paratrooper. And you're right, because I just thumbed through the book, and the first page, after they leave the airplane, of him starting to tell the story to his fellow passenger, the first page of a flashback, page 11 in the hard copy, the captions are worded in the third person, like the beginning of a Twilight Zone episode.
Oh, good point. I hadn't realized that.
In fact, here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically, this particular specimen is Private Rodman Serling, age 18, a Jewish boy from small town Binghamton, New York. He's hell-bent on becoming a paratrooper. So all the author was doing was using a Twilight Zone, a Twilight Zone introduction to introduce us to Rod Serling without much more background than all you need to know is this is his goal and he's going to stop at nothing to become a paratrooper.
Mm-hmm.
Then it switches to the first person after that.
But the caption boxes are still the same black or white text on black.
Yes.
And so he's narrating his own life as if he's the host of his own life. It's kind of weird when you think about it, but it's cool.
Yeah.
I love how Shadme has taken the show and his life and just meld them together to tell the story about the show and his life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Okay, and then unless you have something else about this part, George.
No, we can move on to part 2.
So next is the next parts are about his college time and his writing career. So that's, he takes the GI Bill, he goes to college, he gets interested in writing, and you mentioned this already, but writing about his experiences during the war helped him process things because he actually suffered from they called it shell shocked back then.
Yes.
But he had PTSD and night terrors. He said the rest of his life because of his experience during the war.
I can only imagine. I would be the same way. I can only imagine.
I can't even imagine. That would just be horrible. I don't know that I could have been a soldier and survived what these guys went through.
Being the person I am today, no way. I mean, maybe things were, maybe it would have grown up differently back then, but the person I am today, no way.
There's one point where, he's doing his writing thing, and this quote just leapt out at me on the page because, oh man, have I felt this way before myself, right? He says, everything I wrote is a big heap of garbage. And in my notes, I just simply wrote, been there. So yeah, I totally understand that. There's a point in this, George. Again, I saw a lot of similarities between the Twilight Zone and Serling's career, generally speaking.
Okay.
Between, or similarities to Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek. So, the way that Serling describes the Twilight, I can't remember the page now, but he describes the Twilight Zone to the CBS executive reminds me of how Roddenberry described Star Trek, or at least, reportedly described Star Trek. And then you mentioned Desi Arnaz, and just like with Star Trek, it was Desilu Productions that produced Star Trek, and it was because of Desi Arnaz that Serling basically got to do the Twilight Zone.
Because again, this theme about the people who make the decisions, the people with the money, the people make the decisions, the people in the suits, let's put it that way, the cigar chomping, overweight cigar chomping people who think that they're better than everybody else, those people making the decisions were telling him no. Mm-hmm. And it took a person like Desi Arnaz to say, no, I like it. Let's do it. And everybody's like, yes, Mr. Arnaz. Yes, Mr. Arnaz. All of a sudden, they kowtow to Desi Arnaz. Whereas before, they won't give Rod Serling the time of day because why should they? He's a nobody, right?
Yeah, right. So but he is able to finagle through perseverance and determination and talent. Because he was talented. They spent a lot of time on his first big break on television where he wrote. I don't remember the name of the story now. The teleplay that they did, but he got a lot.
You mean the one for Desilu Productions or the one for Playhouse?
I think I'm referring
60?
to the Playhouse one. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, he like I said, he had some talent and some recognition of that talent, and so he's able to maneuver into being the showrunner of Twilight Zone, having creative control over the show, which is basically unheard of. Even Gene Roddenberry didn't have that for Star Trek. Well, maybe at first he did, but that quickly went away. And also, he was host of the show and wrote a good majority of the episodes. So he was burning the candle at both ends for sure, which caused troubles in his personal life with his wife and family. But also, of course, creatively, because he was having trouble coming up with things, right? And so that plays really kind of later in his life. But it's funny because in my notes, George, I have some the notes I just went over with you about his college and writing career. I basically skip over the whole Twilight Zone stuff. Because, there, I mean, you should read the book to find out the details there, but there really wasn't much to me that was really, really interesting, very interesting. So I don't know if there's something you wanted to cover about that point, because then my notes pick up after
the Twilight
Zone ends, after 5 years later. So,
okay, well, you had mentioned the show that got him the national attention. So first of all, it took a contest while he was in college to get him exposure beyond his college town, winning a contest, and then eventually deciding that this is what he wants to do. And the script that got him the national recognition at first was for back then, and I found this the history of television part about the history of television very fascinating. I love this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all forget, even people in our demographic, but people younger than us, they don't realize that back when in the early days of television, there were a lot of anthology shows that were like there were a lot of things like Twilight Zone. I mean, not science fiction, but a lot of anthology shows, because when television was young, they were following the model of radio and
stage productions.
Exactly, because that's all they knew. That's all they knew to do, and a lot of it was live at the time also.
That's right.
So they were plays pretty much, and a lot of them, depending on the budget, may only wind up being in one location just for budgetary reasons. But the screenplay that got him his national attention was called Patterns for the Kraft Television Theater.
Yeah. Okay.
And on page 83 in the hard copy, it says, Patterns is a story of power, ambition, and the price tag that hangs on success. It is also a conflict of youth versus age. For every man that moves up, someone else has to move out. Which is really the eternal conflict in business.
Well, and central to his own story, right? And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I mean, the foreshadowing, the obvious but still poignant nature of that particular situation, right? I mean, that had I think even he later in the narrative comments on that too, about how he says something about how the irony was not lost on him. I'm trying to find in my notes here if I actually wrote that down. The irony of how, here it is. This is later in the book. In the 60s, he was doing television commercials to make ends meet, right? The irony wasn't lost on me. Television's former angry young man now surrendered to the same commercialism he had so passionately criticized.
And I was going to bring that up. One of the things that made him known as the angry young man in Hollywood was his war with the sponsors.
And the network.
And the network, because when it came to the sponsors, though, he felt it broke up the screenplay too much. Like, for instance, if you're going to see a play on Broadway, you don't all of a sudden get an advertisement for Schlitz.
Right, a commercial during the production, yeah.
Right, yeah. So
but that was
always aggravating. Yeah, of course they did that, right? And in fact, sometimes even wrote it in, where the actors would just light up a cigarette and go, "Hey, it's Lucky Strike time," or whatever it was, right? So he hated that. That was one of the things one of the many things that he butted heads with the networks about. So that's why that is so important, what you just described, when he actually did the commercial and other commercials later in his life, that he was basically selling out and doing the things that he was fighting against. All the network executives always thought his scripts were too high concept. And again, almost going back to the Hedy Lamarr thing, we want families to watch. We don't want to be talking about what's going on in this political conflict, this war over here, this conflict there. We just want everybody to watch the TV and almost be mindless boobs is pretty much what they wanted, which is why it's the idiot box, a lot of people used to call it.
Yep.
Because that's what the network executives wanted to feed all of us at the time when we only had 3 major channels.
Yeah, again, another connection to Roddenberry, because it's very similar struggle that he had. Mm-hmm. I wonder if those two ever met and talked.
That would be very interesting, because you are right. You have the Western in space with all sorts of stories that, had they told them in a straightforward way, the network executives would never have allowed that. Well, and the same thing with the Twilight Zone, sci-fi.
Yeah. Yeah, Serling actually, talks about that in particular in here about, wrap these allegories, these morality plays in science fiction or fantasy, and you can get away with a lot with the network back then, and and that was the same approach that Roddenberry famously took.
There's a great depiction of one of the episodes where, and I kind of remember the episode a bit. In fact, I think maybe Claude Akins was. I'm trying to think of who was in it. Anyway, whatever famous actor was in it, the artist was trying to convey that actor, I think, and I forget what his name is. But a meteor touches down. Everybody sees a meteor, and the townspeople think an alien lives amongst them, and they confront the person that they think is an alien. If you wanted to tell that story as an immigrant moved into the white neighborhood, you can't do that, right? So this is why the Twilight Zone is so special and important in TV history. Before we move on to part 3, though, I would like to point out that the screenplay that wound up being the inspiration for the Twilight Zone, called The Time Element, wound up being, when Serling presented it to the network executive kind of yesed him to death, and then it got filed away into the circular file, if you know what I mean. But it was more like a Raiders of the Lost Ark type of thing, where it got filed into the big, massive, immense area of file cabinets, and whatever drawer it went into. I mean, it was pretty interesting to see that we're Raiders of the Lost Ark in this now.
Yeah,
look at that.
Yeah.
And part 2.
I had the same thought, George. It reminded me of that scene from Raiders. So that was good.
Shall we move on to part 3?
Yeah. So like I said, the story's kind of straightforward, and so I actually don't have a lot of notes on the rest of the book.
Let's just say that the Time Element, that particular script, winds up getting pulled out of the Raiders of the Lost Ark filing limbo, and gets made by Desilu Studios, and it's a hit. Because if I remember how it went, somebody was trying to get some script from Rod Serling, and he said, that Time Element one that I sold to CBS ages ago would fit the bill of what you're asking me for. So they bought it from CBS. And I think they said $10,000 or something like that, which was an exorbitant fee at the time.
Yeah, high sum, it says.
Yeah, and then CBS, of course, realizes the mistake they made, and now they all of a sudden want to do business with Rod Serling.
Yeah,
that's supposed to show you how it works. Yeah, it's how Hollywood works.
Yeah.
On page 128 in the hard copy, the captions for the first 2 panels: "The nation was in the grips of a wave of paranoia. The air was thick with fear and distrust, the putrid scent of McCarthyism. I was outraged with where we were headed as people: bigotry, totalitarianism, and war." So these are the stories that he wanted to, these are the feelings he wanted to express in his screenplays. And of course, he couldn't do them in a straightforward way. And how could he do them? As a Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, and then we get some panels here depicting a couple of the episodes.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's called Eye of the Beholder. This is the famous pig-faced one.
Yep.
And then something with Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith. I don't recognize that one. I thought at first it was going to be what was the one where he was the bookworm, but that's not it. I think it's a different one.
No, I think you're right. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they definitely did not make the network happy with a lot of these things, regardless of the wrapping of things in the sci-fi / fantasy realms. Like I said, he's burning the candle at both ends, and he ends up having an anxiety attack. I think it was.
That's what they called it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A panic attack.
Yeah. But it turns out, down the road, there's some other health issues that ends up causing him a particular issue. Anyway, so is there anything else about that time period, George? This is when his marriage is starting to fall apart, and things aren't going well with the show and the network. He continually pushes people and tries, because he's trying to create something special and trying to promote certain ideas, like you just talked about, right? And he's just constantly butting heads. He's constantly boxing with his adversaries, and there's only so much you can do there before it catches up to you or it beats you down.
In talking about the history of television, I find this fascinating. All it takes, even in business, all it takes is for there to be a managerial shift or a supervisor shift. And I'm not even talking about it on the board of directors of some big company. I'm talking about maybe even in your office, Eric. All it takes is a new manager to come in. Maybe somebody got promoted from another department or something like that. Or somebody came in from the outside and all of a sudden now they want to clean house or something like that. Well, after the quiz show scandal of the 50s, a new CBS president came in. And it's interesting to see how these kinds of changes can affect so much. It kind of reminded me almost like of the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction during the Super Bowl, which I believe happened 17 years ago, which would have been the last time that there were cicadas. So if anybody's where cicadas are now, think about that. I may be wrong about that, but I think that was that time. So think about what's happened since the last time Brood X has hit here in on the East Coast. Anyway, that's an aside. Something like that affected even talk radio. Shock jocks all of a sudden had to clean up their act because of what happened in a visual medium at the Super Bowl. So something simple like that all of a sudden affects all these things. Mm-hmm. And it just made me start thinking about that. So this guy who became the new president of CBS, he didn't like all this highbrow entertainment, and he thought it cost too much to make. He was like, oh, one of these Desilu production things, or what was it? Not Desilu production, but it was, darn it, what was the name of it? It was Playhouse 90 or something like that. And he thought that each episode cost too much to make. And he included in that Twilight Zone episodes. And his mantra was, these prestige shows have to go, and he wants to use frauds, bosoms, and fun to cater to the lowest common denominator in the country. And in the book, it says that's how we got things like Beverly Hillbillies and Gilligan's Island. So think of those two shows in relation to shows like The Twilight Zone. And you can see how those decisions get made. I find this stuff fascinating, how certain things do get to hit the air. And once again, they screw them. They in fact, when the last episode of that Playhouse 90 aired, it was a Rod Serling script. And it was an episode about the Warsaw Ghetto. And I did this with the Hedy Lamarr discussion. I'm going to do it now. On page 137, there is the dialogue between Robert Redford, who's playing a compassionate Nazi officer, speaking with one of his superiors. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing except the last panel on page 137, because there is a morality in hating, Sergeant. It happens to be a clue for survival. Nations can feed on it. They find their strength in it. They are nurtured by it. That episode right there And even just those simple couple of lines still apply today, and they will always apply, unfortunately. And you know why? Because I said it before when we were talking about the Hedy Lamarr thing. I'm going to say it again, and I'm probably going to be saying it till forever. We're stupid. Humans are stupid. We're sheep being led by the shepherd, and sometimes the sheep are led by the wrong shepherd. Sometimes you got to think for yourself and not do these stupid things. And you know what? I'm a human too. So I do these stupid things too. We all do it. But unfortunately, when you see it being done on certain scales, you realize
and over and over and over,
we should be better than this. This is from a TV show in the 50s trying to tell us how dumb we are, how stupid we are. Smarten up. Don't go with the broads and the bosoms and the fun. Think. Learn. I mean, right there, just that page, 137. And I'll admit, I don't know this episode. Do you know this episode?
I don't.
I'm not. Oh, well, because it's not a Twilight Zone, actually. It's a Playhouse 90, so it's probably lost to the ages.
Yeah, good point. Good points. So
yeah, sorry about that. I have to know. When I read things like that, I'm like, that should be as ancient history to everybody. Anybody who's listening to this who was born in this century, listening to us talk about Hedy Lamarr, Marilyn Monroe, Rod Serling. To them, this stuff is ancient history. Well, the things that were talked about right there, that should be ancient history too. And unfortunately, it's not.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, I'm off my soapbox.
So, George, remember the title page image that I pointed out? So,
yes, the whole Vertigo thing.
Yeah, we get that on page. My page is 140, I think. Mm-hmm. And so this is when let's see, what does he say? Yeah, so this is not a physical manifestation of anything, but it's representative of, I keep saying he was burning the candle at both ends. This is when he talks about, this is during season 3 of the show. And he says, stories used to bubble out of me so fast I couldn't get them down on paper quick enough. No more. I was writing so much to the point where I wasn't able to retain quality in much of the work. I began borrowing from myself, repeating myself, making my own cliches. And we see him falling into that vortex. That's the word I was looking for earlier. It looks like a vortex to me. So, yeah, things are not going well for him, or starting to not go well for him.
Oh, and not only after CBS screwed him and canceled his show, but they convinced him to sell his remaining rights. Remember you said how innovative it was for him to have those kind of rights in the first place? Mm-hmm. They convinced him, oh, well, now the Twilight Zone's over. I mean, it's just going to be shelved just like the original script was. It's going to go into that Raiders of the Lost Ark room. No one's ever going to see it again. There's no money to be made here.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, look, they knew syndication was in the picture. They knew.
And so that leads us into part 4 of the story. And this is his later life. He's I think we mentioned this before. He's doing commercials. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want to do. He wrote the Planet of the Apes script, and they basically changed a bunch of stuff, which he did not like. But that happens. He was the host of the you mentioned game show earlier. The Scandals back then. Well, he was hosting a show called The Liars Club, which he did not particularly care for either, but. But he was doing it because he could never say no, because he had, even early on, when that first taste of success, that he had from the first production that he wrote, he started getting all these offers and he said yes to everything and quickly found that was problematic. Right. So even then he just, he had this drive in him to keep producing, to keep creating, to keep moving forward. He's like a shark, I guess. He had to keep moving, otherwise he was gonna end up dead. And so maybe, unless you have something else, George, that kind of leads me to what happens to him in 1975, which is he has a heart attack, and not only that, but he has, what do you say here? He says a second, more severe heart attack came several weeks later, and they wanted to do open heart surgery, which back then was, as he says, a relatively new, risky procedure.
Mhm.
And this is where we get the twist ending.
Okay, like on my show, we'd have spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
And then we get which is the epilogue. So he has a heart attack, or he dies on the operating table, right? And then we get the epilogue, and we get the Pan Am plane in the darkness. It's just that one panel where it's just the plane in sheer darkness, no longer a night sky. It's just black. And so, ooh, something's different here. But he says to himself, this realization, I died. I'm dead. And his female passenger says, "What a tale. Bravo. You lived quite a life, Mr. Serling." And then we get this lovely scene. I mentioned the passengers on the plane having the black faces, and that, the final page of this is all of them turning to look at him. Like I said, black faces, you can't make out the features except for the small white eyes staring at him. That was creepy as hell, George, when I got to that page. And, they're telling him it's all right. You don't need to worry. We're taking you where you need to go. Rest assured, you will arrive at your destination eventually.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is in his own Twilight Zone story.
Yeah. And the last page is on your digital, where they have the actual picture of him with the icons that we've seen throughout the issue throughout the book, plus other icons superimposed over him.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was
really
nice,
good.
Nice touch.
Yeah.
Now, when you started the book, did you think that after the story was told, he was going something along the lines of what's the name of the William Shatner episode? Something at 20,000 feet, Terror of 20,000
Nightmare at 20,000 feet.
Nightmare.
Yeah.
Did you think? And the guy did this. The author did this on purpose. I know it, because I thought that he was going to be the one to say something to her at the end when the story was done. Maybe not necessarily having the gremlin on the wing, but I thought in the end he was going to pull a Twilight Zone-y thing and then kind of look to us as the reader and go, and that's what happens in the Twilight Zone or something like that.
Oh, okay,
I thought it was
something
like that. Did you have any preconceived notions when the story started in an airplane like that?
No, I actually anticipated the ending that we got because of that opening sequence, and the faces of the passengers were dark, with a few exceptions. And this, I mentioned my critique of that, because there were a couple panels where you could actually kind of make out some of the faces, and I realized I know why the artist did that, because it would you could, this is one of those things I really love about comics, right? Because we as readers just kind of accept that these faces are dark in the way that they are because they're non-consequential actors within this scene, right?
Right, exactly. It's like having the blurry background when a camera is focusing on the people in the foreground.
Yeah. Something very similar to that, right? So in the panels where they actually show the faces, there's one in particular where the stewardess they're interacting with her, and the artist for some reason chose to turn the camera on her during that scene. And so you kind of you don't see everything clearly because the top part of her face is cut off and in shadow, but you do make out some features on her. And then there's also another panel with another guy. That aside, because of the way that was being presented and the curious, I'll say, interest that his fellow passenger has in him and his story, I thought, this is something we're going to get something like the end that we got. I didn't know exactly, but it was, to me, it was.
And see, I'm a rube thinking it would have been the other way around, thinking that the reason that we didn't get details of the passengers' faces was because there was going to be a reveal about them, almost a la Eye of the Beholder episode, where all of a sudden they were going to turn around on her, and then that's when he was going to turn to us as the reader.
That would have been cool too.
In the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
So that's what I was expecting.
Yeah,
so,
I actually wouldn't have minded that.
And he probably anticipated that rubes like there would be maybe 50-50 people like you who could have guessed the ending, and rubes like me who were going the other way, and that it would actually be a surprise at the end for a guy like me. Did you read the essay in the back? Was it the essay part of the digital?
I don't. Nope, it is not.
Oh, so it makes me wonder if Marilyn's Monsters or the Hedy Lamarr book have essays, even though that they're translated. I wonder if they have. I wonder if they have essays. Now I'm going to be very curious if you get that hard copy of Marilyn's Monsters, like you said you were going to do.
I'm definitely getting that. That's for sure.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to go into detail on the essays. The essay the author wrote, except to say that he had intended to write the Rod Serling graphic novel years ago, but got involved in other projects. And in getting ready to create this book, he had purchased a lot of biographies and a lot of material about Rod Serling to use as research. But it all wound up on his bookshelf collecting dust for years. And he had finally found the time in 2016 to start this. So it had been on his mind for years before he actually had an opportunity to start it. And what did you say? It came out in 2018?
19.
19. Okay, so if he got started in 2016, and he made a point of saying that because that was the time Trump got elected. So he made a point of saying that the time frame that he started to actually finally to put pen to paper and actually create this book. It just goes to show how long it was just simmering in his mind.
Oh yeah.
To do, although he didn't really start the research until 2016 to get it going, but he had been thinking about it all that time. Oh, and I will say this about the essay. He also has a couple of thumbnail sketches of the evolution of the cover. The cover, he has different concept art for what he had intended the cover to be. Well, so that is kind of interesting to check out.
There you go. That's always been one of the reasons for pro print versus digital comics, because you get.
I'm surprised.
You get
I'm
those
surprised
things.
When they had that in, it's just like 2 pages.
I know. I don't understand that. I feel cheated now.
It makes no sense
for the 99 cents that I spent.
I know, right?
Okay, before we leave this book, George, I wanted to talk about those interstitial pages, like I said, that preceded every part.
Oh, definitely.
And so what this is a collection of images from the various episodes of the Twilight Zone. And so, for example, I've already mentioned this before, but the pig-faced nurse from the Eye of the Beholder episode. There is the big-headed alien, which is from the classic To Serve Man episode. And then we get a bunch of other ones here. I'm going to list off the ones that I recognized, and if I miss anything, George, please fill me in here. And this was a lot of fun. Once I was actually looking at this page, I was like, oh, that one. Oh, that one. Oh, that one. I've seen that episode.
Yeah, now you're going to do way better at this than me. I'm going to have nothing going for you.
So I guess, basically the first set of these that I'm going to mention are the ones that I immediately picked up on because I actually watched those episodes. I did have to look up the names of them. I didn't know all the names, but so like I said, those two are the first ones. The Jack in the Box, the head coming out of the Jack in the Box, as the Jack in the Box, I should say. That is from the very terrifying episode, It's a Good Life. If you remember that, the kid who had those basically godlike powers.
Right. And that one actually made it to the movie too.
Oh yeah. Yes, that's right. That's right. There's the fortune teller machine from the Nick of Time episode starring William Shatner. Speaking of the Twilight Zone movie, appearing in the Twilight Zone movie, the gremlin from the Nightmare at 20,000 Feet that we've mentioned before, also starring William Shatner. There from the episode The Invaders, which I remember watching that and going, this is a really weird one to me. But it was weird more because of the fact that there was very little dialogue in this one, because it was basically one person against this tiny robot. And we also get the flying saucer from that episode. That one I had to look up a little bit. It's like, I thought I recognized that one, but I wasn't sure. And then in the course of my research, I discovered, or I found pictures of that what looks like a robot, but it turns out, well, maybe I shouldn't spoil that episode. You should go watch it. There's Robbie the Robot from, I think, Uncle Simon, which an episode I did not watch, or it could be from, there actually, Robbie the Robot actually appeared in at least 2, maybe 3 episodes of the Twilight Zone, as I discovered. There's a woman with a tag on her chest that reads Marilyn, and that is from number 12, Looks Just Like You, another episode I have not seen. And there's a doll in here, a little girl doll from, I think, the episode The Living Doll. And then the other 2 things that I saw, and maybe I missed something, but the other 2, there's this skull with eyes that's in there, and then also the male bust that also is one of the images that preceded the first part of this. So I have no idea what those are or what those are from.
And I was wondering if the Twilight Zone aficionado, if they saw those and they recognized all of these, if there was a reason for choosing the ones that were chosen at the beginning of each part, but it escapes me if there was a reason.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I was thinking the same thing. It's like, okay, so does this image signify anything?
Right. Yeah.
What does it signify about this part or about the story, the greater story of the whole? So part 1 is that male bust, but not knowing the context, what that episode was about, it's hard to say. I will extrapolate if you don't mind. Does it signify the making of the man? Because here's a bust of a man. I don't take it that way as you will. Part 2 is the fortune teller, the coin operated fortune teller from the Nick of Time episode. Be careful what you wish for, perhaps. Okay. Let's see. Part 3 is
you're good at this.
Well, I did study literature in college, so I should have some abilities here in that regard. Part 3 is the pig-faced nurse. This is stupid. Success is in the eye of the beholder, right? And then part 4 is the Jack in the Box with the dunce cap, and that's from that episode that I mentioned already. So what's the significance there? There's a stronger power at play that transforms him or alters his destiny, and that's, he ends up dying along with everything else that was going on. And then finally the epilogue, and this is the weird one. That's the Invaders robot. So because I don't know what to say. I don't know how much to say, because I don't want to spoil. If you haven't seen the Invaders, you just need to watch it. But maybe the significance is, just his defeat, his demise, he's dead. That doesn't quite fit in my mind, but that's kind of what I went with.
And not knowing all the episodes, but being able to recognize some of the iconography that he did use. The fact that I was able to recognize some just made me think these were images from some of the more popular episodes. More well-known episodes. Yeah. So it might have just been, there may not be a reason to have chosen any particular one to accompany the separation of chapters.
It could have just been those were the creator's favorite episodes. Who knows?
Right. Something like that. Yeah. Now, so you kind of told your history of with Twilight Zone real quick. I watch some syndication here and there. I do get fished in on the New Year's, and usually around the Independence Day, there are marathons. Usually, they have them every 6 months. They usually coincide with Independence Day and New Year's. And I usually get fished in. And the problem is, whenever I get fished in, it's usually probably at about the same time. And I don't know if they're showing them in order or if they're shuffling them. But I always seem to catch the same ones. So that's why my knowledge of the Twilight Zone isn't as great as others. However, I will say this. Back in the day, I was born and raised in New York. There was a museum called the Museum of Television and Radio. I believe now it's called the Paley Center.
Oh, yeah.
And this is in the days before the internet. You would go there and, like a library, you would ask for tapes of old TV shows, old made for TV movies, or radio plays, but you couldn't take them out. Maybe if you were a member, you could take them out, but you would sit in a booth and you would watch whatever it was that you borrowed. And I went there a couple of times. Got watched different things, listened to different radio plays, but the one souvenir, and if anybody listens to my show, you'll know a couple of weeks ago we talked about souvenirs. One of the souvenirs I got from the place was a Rod Serling T-shirt, and the image of Rod Serling was drawn by Al Hirschfeld. I'm a big Al Hirschfeld, and there were a couple of shirts that they had with his artwork depicting whatever TV, maybe Lucille Ball or whoever. But I had to have that Rod Serling one, and darn if I didn't wear that one to death.
I'm very jealous. That would be something that I think I would love to go and experience.
I have not gone there since the age of the internet. So I can't even tell you what the place is like now. And in fact, like I said, the name has changed now. I think it's the Paley Center. And I believe it still has the same mission. But in today's day and age, you can get a lot of this stuff on the internet, but maybe this is the more official way to get, instead of trying to get it bootlegged on YouTube. And some things that aren't in syndication, that's where you can watch.
Yeah. I actually ordered a Buffy the Vampire Slayer cast interview.
No way.
Hosted by the Paley Center, and I was able to purchase that video of that discussion. So, and I've seen others on the internet as well, because I think they released some of those on YouTube or something. Mm-hmm. And this is years ago, but yeah, that's interesting that you've had that experience, and I've had my kind of experience with the Paley Center. So that's good. Okay, shall we move on to our favorite? Last but certainly not least, Marilyn's Monsters.
I don't know if people can hear me rubbing my hands together in anticipation of this discussion.
And with that little teaser, I will end the episode. I hope you enjoyed that. Please let me or George know what you think of Twilight Man or our previous book that we talked about, Hedy Lamarr. And you could do so by emailing me at longboxreview@gmail.com, or you can look at the show notes for all of George's contact information and social media addresses. Thanks for listening.